Hi, Maya.
Hi, Heidi. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation with Heidi Grasswick about oppression and scientific authority. So I'm glad to be here with Professor Grasswick to talk about this. This, of course, is an area of Heidi's research, and I'm using her new article in The Philosopher. The name is Oppression and Scientific Authority as a launching point, but we can, of course, draw from her knowledge and expertise in this area of science studies to speak more broadly to the issue. So I wanted to start today with a leading question, and then I'm going to break it down into numerous questions for Heidi. The leading questions are, does science deserve the epistemic authority granted to it? And if not, how much does it deserve? And both Heidi and I see this as a question that's very relevant to our current political climate. We live in at a time where the general status of science is highly politicized. You see numerous debates where you get two extremes or poles where you've got, let's call them the science believers, where you're supposed to believe science, defer to its truth. And on the other side, the deniers who want to deny or reject the authority of scientific claims. Now, most of us probably don't identify with either of these extremes, but it's easy to get caught up in that rhetoric of which team you're on, given the stress of the pandemic and with so much at stake. So we begin sort of with the understanding that science, of course, isn't supposed to be something you're supposed to believe in or be against, but we might think about how it is that we got here. And talking about the relationship between science and oppression is a good way of doing that. So turning to Heidi, your article, of course, identifies good and bad, let's say the good and the bad of scientific practices. And we'd like to increase the good and decrease the bad. And of course, maybe from there we can determine the correct measure of science's epistemic authority. But just to start us off, can you review the main arguments from your article for those that haven't read it yet?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Maya. And I bet almost no one's read it since it just came out, but with a few exceptions like yourself who got early access. But thanks so much for doing this, Maya. And also thank you, Anthony, for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to chat about this with people because it's certainly something I find really interesting. So what I did in this particular piece was I was asked to think about the authority of science. And for that, I wanted to think about what do we mean epistemically? Which obviously it is political authority, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about epistemic authority. And by that, I understand that as being likely to either take science at its word, maybe that's too strong, but to certainly allow science to shape one's beliefs and also my actions or in a larger scale policies, right? So if we want to grant an institution power to shape our beliefs and policies, we would be granting epistemic authority to it. And I think of this in terms of the institutions of science. But okay, so what grounds that? Why might you want to give authority to science, or why might you not? And obviously, a lot of people will look at the historical success of science in developing our understandings of the natural and social worlds that then have allowed us to, in some cases quite well, negotiate our way through these worlds. And many people will appeal to its rigorous empirical methods. And that's certainly a really important piece of it. But we also know that science only gets done by people in communities that they're involved in making the science, and they do so in a social way. People work on science in communities. They interact, they criticize each other's results. They make decisions on where they're going to take science based on their hunches and their interests and what they think will pay off. And there's social elements in that. And there's certain developments of social practices within science. Think of peer review, for example. That may not be the empirical aspects of science, but it's a very important aspect of science. And what makes it successful is that there's a sifting done of the different work, and that can help science succeed. So some of the social elements actually help science succeed, but others can get in the way of the goals of science. And when I say that, we might mean either the goals of the researchers and what they're trying to achieve, but also the goals of those of us outside of science and are not as non-experts If our goals are served well, then we might be more willing to give authority to science in shaping our beliefs and actions. And if we feel some disconnect between ourselves and whatever's going on socially in science, then we may be less likely to do that. The other thing I really want to stress is that when we're thinking about the authority of science, as you pointed out, Maya, it's easy to get caught into that. You're either a science believer or a science denier, in part because things are so politically hot on that right now. But really, the authority we grant science is always much more located, right? In terms of whether it's a field or it's a specific context where I'm willing to turn to science, or not just willing, but anxious in some cases to ask the scientists what they think. And part of paying attention to that context is also the fact that we recognize that even if you think that science is a great way to know the world, and we need to give it resources and we need to pay attention to it, in any point in time when we're really granting authority to science, that's not what we're doing. We're granting authority to particular scientist communities, topics. We're saying, okay, right here, right now, I'm going to offer you that authority. Now, the sort of a long overview, but the key, of course, is that my argument then is that oppression within the wider society can actually give us reasons to think that science may not be working as well as some of us at sometimes either thought or hoped. And the interactions between systems of oppression and the practices of science, that can trip science up in a number of different ways. And it can also mean that if we're trying to understand why a person may or may not grant authority to a particular area of science, that might very well depend on the vantage point that they occupy and how it's looking to them. Like, have people who look like me and have had similar experience as me, do I see that that's informing the research represented in science or not? Yeah, so my conclusion ultimately then is that if we want science to really have more authority, or not have more authority, but if we want to be able to turn to it, ultimately, we're going to need to work on eliminating oppression if we want scientific research to be able to serve all of society well, in a nutshell. Now, you don't have to read it.
You might still want to read it. So you've given a really nice characterization of a social account of science, and people that know your work won't be surprised by that. And you do a nice characterization of it in your article. So that's the nature of science. You see it as highly social. So it's more than the abstract empiricism and its methods, but also the social. You also spend a bit of time talking about the nature of oppression. So I wonder if we could speak a little more about that. You draw from Marilyn Frye's famous book of feminist essays, The Politics of Reality, specifically her wonderful essay, Oppression, and you use her famous birdcage analogy to make this important point about the structure of oppression. Can you review that? And can you also link that to the point, the broader point about scientific oppression and authority?
Sure, yeah. So of course, the root of the word oppression comes from to press, or to press down on. And we understand it in contemporary terms when we're talking about oppression as being social structures that restrict the lives of certain groups and social identities. So one of the key features of oppression that Marilyn Frye and other feminists have pointed out is that you are oppressed as a member of a social group. You are not oppressed as an individual. You may be treated very badly as an individual. That's certainly possible. But what makes it oppression is when it's targeted at part of your social identity as part of a group. And one of the, perhaps the most important feature that feminists and critical race theorists have noted about oppression is that it's very systemic and it's very structural. So it's not just the experience of one event of saying being discriminated against or being put down. That may be part of it, but that's so easy to miss. What really is going on, oppression occurs when there are social frameworks that are set up in such a way that they benefit some groups over others. So the birdcage analogy that Marilyn Frye uses, which, yeah, it's very famous, and it's just such a clear way of thinking of this, is why is it then that sometimes oppression is actually hard to see? And that's because, yes, it presses and it holds people down, it restricts people. But if you think about a bird in a birdcage, and if you were to just look at one wire at a time, and you just sort of stared at that wire in a microscopic view, it would be confusing to you or unfathomable to understand why the bird couldn't just fly around the wire. But if you see the whole interlocking system of the cage, even some of those wires could be pretty thin. But if you see them all juxtaposed together, then you can understand why the bird is not free to just fly through or around or whatever. And so it's this set of interlocking structures that create oppression. And I said that part of why it's important is because if she's arguing that that's where you need to look at the macroscopic view, you need to step back and look at the whole thing and how these different features of society are playing into one's experience, then we're going to have to do that with science, right? We're going to have to look at the big picture and try to understand where it fits into potentially oppressive systems. Where might there be elements where you would say that in itself is oppressive, but that when it's in this particular context, we've got all these other restrictions and problems. Yes, now we've got oppression going. And also then how we shouldn't expect science, since it is within our society, to be immune from oppression. And in fact, we can see there's lots of different ways in which they have intersected.
Maybe we can get into that. So what are some of the ways that oppression can damage science?
Yeah, so in this article, I actually stress 4 different ways. It's not the only 4, but it was a nice way of framing it. And the first would be simply there being a lack of diverse representation within science. So we know that many visible minorities are underrepresented in science. We know that gender, there's sort of this leaky pipeline of women who may start in science and then a leaky pipeline, meaning they don't make it all the way to the top. They sift out at a higher rate. And that can actually damage the quality of the science. And some people make the argument that of course it damages the quality because you don't have necessarily, if there's discrimination going on, you don't have the smartest people there. But there are other reasons to think that it damages it as well. And that's because we may need critical diversity within that social aspect of the critical review that's going on in science in order to draw attention to people's biases or people's assumptions that may play a role. So that's one, just the lack of representation within science that can actually damage its quality. The other thing is that if you have maybe connected to lack of representation, but not directly, there also may be, if we have a society where we have oppression, there may be a lack of interest or attention socially in the needs of certain social groups. If that's the case, science often reflects what our society takes to be our important goals, and that can skew the direction of science. So science may not be able to create knowledge that is of importance for some marginalized communities to understand. So that can also skew, the reason why that also affects the quality is if you skew the work that's being done, then it's like you haven't got the full picture yet. So you may be overemphasizing that or underemphasizing it, or you may be misinterpreting what your results are. Then the last 2 that I mentioned they do affect the quality of science, but I will also say where they really affect it is the authority of science, whether we should be giving science the authority that we will need to if we want to be able to use science as a way of knowing. And that is if science has participated in oppressive systems. For example, if it has a history, say in human subjects research, of exploiting certain groups, and so let's just say using like the Tuskegee syphilis study, where poor Black men were exploited and used for a study and were not given the available treatments, then that actually, in a certain sense, demotes the science as opposed to why would I give authority to them if that kind of activity is happening there. And the fourth case is that we have histories of sexist science. We have histories of scientific racism, where science has actually been employed in order to further the goals of oppression by trying to argue that certain groups are have a lower IQ or whatever. So, and then in many cases that some of those instances have been poor quality science, but they've passed for science because it fits with the biases and the prejudices, the androcentrism or the racism of society. And so that also has both harmed it and also harmed why whatever grounds for authority that it needs actually.
So that last point is particularly interesting because that's not something we could tie a bow around and say, well, we're finished with that. Like we've corrected all our past injustices on human subject research. We have not. I know you know that. But this one suggests that the biases that now seemed appalling from past scientific research, we might find that even our practices today will one day be judged that way.
Right, exactly. And I think that's also an important point to recognize, that science is always open-ended, right? We expect science to continually be trying to improve upon itself. And that also puts us in an awkward position of, if I'm going to give it authority, it's the results of now that I'm giving authority to, right? So we always want to put sort of that authority is still understanding that that's maybe the best we have at this moment. But it also brings up going back to that issue of lack of representation, that also comes back to, it will be easier to examine and catch some of those biases if we have a wide range of people within our scientific communities and doing some of that work, right?
So is that to say that you could offer us some characteristics of what a non-oppressive science would look like? What would the qualities be of the kind of science that you think is trustworthy and deserving of epistemic authority?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there's a few things. And I also want to say that even if we straighten this out, which of course we can never actually be done with this, but non-oppressive science is not going to be enough. There's still going to be lots of other ways in which science could go wrong that we could think about. But specifically with non-oppressive science, I mean, we would want to see highly diverse research teams. We would want to see scientists consulting with marginalized groups in society regarding what their needs are, what's important to them, and what knowledge they have, what knowledge certain lay communities may have that might inform some of the science or inform the shape of it. There's a good example of where there sort of was an attempt to do a good job here, but it kind of backfired. And this was in the 1990s at Arizona State University, where they did some research on the Havasupai Indians of the Grand Canyon. This is a very small group. And they had been in touch with an anthropologist who they trusted and had been working with for a long time. And they were very concerned about diabetes within their small community. And so the anthropologist put them in touch with some geneticists at Arizona State. And they agreed to do some research, some genetic research. They were looking for a particular marker that would explain some of the connections to diabetes. And so they took blood samples, did that research. And unfortunately, they didn't find the marker, so they weren't able to help as much as they were, but they were taking their needs into consideration and they were trying to do something that would help the community. What went wrong is that after that, and they had them fill out the consent forms that at least they thought they had, right? But what happened as a result of that is then it through sort of, actually it was quite coincidental, but the Havasupai found out that those blood samples were then used for many other pieces of research. They were doing studies on schizophrenia, they were doing studies on origin stories, tracing the genetics, and of course migrations, which then threatened the Havasupai's own belief system. And also they were suggesting that, you know, the genetic pool was small, implying inbreeding, which was a real taboo within their own group. And so it was extremely offensive to them. And in the end, there was a lawsuit. The blood samples had to be returned. They claimed that they did not agree with the sort of broad consent that had been given. But there's an example where there was an attempt to actually deal with the group, but it failed because there wasn't enough of a connection. They did not, obviously the research did not understand how sacred blood was and what these blood samples meant to them. And they certainly felt they had not given consent to do this other work, which they found very offensive to themselves. So that's the kind of thing we want to try and avoid. And that can happen. The way you do that is by building long-term relations with those who are outside science, and basically being in touch, but being in touch with what groups' needs are, and building relations of trust with historically oppressed groups. Those are some of the ways you can overcome it. But
so I appreciate this attention you're giving to public stakeholders, or just the public in general, as important people who are impacted by science. And of course, your point being that marginalized and oppressed groups can be harmed even more by scientific research. So how do you make sense of the kind of status of science debates that are going on now? I'm still working on this. That's why I keep drawing you back to it. On the one hand, there's a lot of survey research on this, and the surveys always say, when people say, do you trust science? Most members of the public say yes. And of course, we don't know exactly what people mean when they say yes to that question. Are they talking about empirical methods? Are they talking about the qualities of a scientist in general? But when those same publics are then asked, what do you think about the status of the more contentious areas, the more politicized areas of science, like climate change or climate science or biomedical research, it scores quite low. Do you think the social epistemology characterization of science as more than one thing? It's epistemic, of course, it's empirical, but it's also got a social dimension. Does that help make sense of why people say yes to some things and no to others? What do you think?
yeah, I think there's probably different things going on in the different fields and the different questions that we can bring up. But I do think there's something that it's not surprising that when you ask the question just generally, you're going to get more of a yes, because yeah, you're right. It's hard to know what people say, but also we know that if you ask about things that say aren't politically contentious, or in fact are so far removed from us, like if you ask someone if they trust what's going on in astronomy or you know, studies of black holes, and that they'll say yes, right, that they trust that. And that's also a certain sense in which that's the stuff that you can also, as a trust theorist, I can think about, is that really trust? And the reason why I would say that is because if I say that I trust their knowledge in something that is so far away from anything that is going to impact me or have any, there's nothing really at stake, right? There's nothing really at stake in saying that. And so I can say, yeah, okay, I kind of rely on them, whatever. But when we think about someone, the idea of trusting, we recognize that there's some kind of vulnerability that goes with that. And so I'm not sure if I'm made vulnerable by trusting in them telling us about black holes. Maybe I want to think about that a little bit more, but it's certainly much clearer when it's right in front of me, and whether it's what the impact will have on policy if we take climate change seriously, or if we're trusting biomedical, and I may have to, and that's saying, when I go in for surgery, I'm trusting them not to screw up on me, right? And that I'm definitely making myself vulnerable in that situation. So there's some pieces of that, and of course, those who those who land more on the I'm willing to grant science authority across a broad range of things, many people will step back into the idea of, well, we know that it's reliable and that it's empirical. But I think that's also, that extreme view also misses the fact that a lot of what's happening when science is being worked on is that it's not just the empirical data, but the empirical data is always being interpreted. We're giving an understanding of what's happening with the data. We're fitting in lots of theories and background knowledge and frameworks that they've been building on. And that's what a believer has to buy into, right? So there's a lot more going on there than just the empirical piece of it. With those who deny or are deniers in particular areas, there's also lots of social psychology work on what is going on there, and that really depends on what exactly the issue is. But I think one of the things I do think is important is that if we want science to be worthy of whatever authority we give it. And so we want to do science as well as possible that will foster that. And one of the things one needs to do, this is going to come back to those robust relations of trust, that if you can get robust relations of trust and how you get that is there's trustworthiness, that science is actually doing a good job responding to the needs and providing us with the knowledge we need. Then if you manage to do that over a period of time and you have a relationship of that, that's when people are going to be okay with a case when science gets it wrong. And they'll say, yeah, but I know you were doing it well and it just didn't work out. I mean, we're seeing that now with the pandemic, with the science coming out so fast and things are changing. And there's two reactions you can have. You can say, yep, this is a reason not to trust them because, 2 months ago, they told me first they told me not to wear a mask. Now they're telling me to wear a mask. Now they're telling me maybe yes or no or different kinds. They're telling me all kinds of different things. And so you can turn off and say, see, they don't know what they're doing. Or you can say, right, they're working hard to try to give me the best knowledge they have. They haven't got it right all the time. Maybe I'll follow their guidance now and hope. And if it changes, I'll change. But know that it can. That's a natural part of what we actually hope for it.
Right. So you seem to be saying that the people who are more willing to grant epistemic authority, it's not that they necessarily have more faith in the methods, but they grant moral authority to the scientists, that they're actually working in our best interest. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, I would say that's a part of it. I don't want to rule out, obviously, I don't want to rule out the empirical part either, because I do think that, and it's not just that we go, yes, we know that the scientists are doing empirical work. We do, I think we can make distinctions. How well is it being done? Is it being done sloppily or not? Where are the problems? And some of those might come from repression, but of course there are many other ways in which science can go awry too, or scientists can become too invested in their own careers and start to get a little sloppy or things. And we hope that if science is working well, those will get caught, right? But there's a lot of other things to pay attention to there.
Okay, here, let me throw another consideration into this. I'm wondering, what are the implications of your analysis about science and its relationships to oppression regarding areas of scientific research that some things should be out of bounds? So I'll give you an example. Some people would say that there is no use of studying the relationship between race and IQ. Right? And others say, well, we set a dangerous precedent when we stifle inquiry. So given all your considerations about the many ways sciences can go wrong, what does that do in terms of that debate about, let's call it the freedom of research controversy?
Yeah, right. Well, first off, I think it's important to recognize that we always set some limits on our scientific research. And those at times in history, those limits, the limits that we set have been expanded. For example, when we look at the developments in human subjects research and what we're willing and not willing to do on human subjects and stringent ethical requirements on how that's done, we've always set some limits like that. I also think it's important to remember that we do have to make priorities. It's just not the case that we can study whatever we want endlessly. Scientific research is not free. It takes money, it takes resources, it takes time, it takes intellectual horsepower. While we do need a diversity in studies and projects, and they can feed into each other, and that's partly why we need that diversity to be able to actually compare them in relation to each other and see what methods are working best. We also have to ask ourselves what kind of a world or society that we desire and what kind of research we think is going to help generate the kind of knowledge we need in order to get there. But lastly, I do want to say, yes, it's true. We do not want to stifle inquiry. But if we are dealing with research that is somehow socially dangerous, in that if we get it wrong or if we allow some of our biases to then be supported by empirical work that is actually only showing up as good empirical work because it's based on those biases, that those are the starting point, then if it's socially dangerous, I think we have to have very high standards for how we're going to consider doing that well. I think Philip Kitchers makes this point also when he says that if there's big potential repercussions for the lives of certain groups of people, then our scientific research must proceed very carefully. And I think that just makes total sense, because why would we want to do it in a way that would create more problems and more harm? And quite honestly, science has had some missteps along the way.
Let's bring in some of your other research. You have written about this idea of epistemic trust injustices, and that seems to connect with what some of the things that you're talking about here regarding oppression and scientific authority. Can you say a little bit about what you mean by epistemic trust injustices and how that relates to our current conversation?
Sure, yeah. So first, I'll say a little bit about the general idea of epistemic injustice, which really is an area, it's actually quite an exciting area of epistemology in the last 15 years or so, where an epistemic injustice is a way in which various people are disadvantaged as knowers. So the idea here is that if we acknowledge that how we know, whether we're talking science or not science, doesn't matter. How we know is very much a social affair. Like most of what we know, we actually know through testimony, through others, right? We don't actually do as much on our own as we think we do. So if knowledge is social and you're prevented from gaining the skills or developing the relationships you need in order to gain certain understanding or recognize yourself as a knower, then that's a form of epistemic injustice, where there's some sort of systemic way in which our social interactions of gaining knowledge make it hard for you to act as a knower, right? So you're dependent. There's a lot of different literature on different areas of epistemic injustice. And one of the things I worked on was thinking about the idea of epistemic injustice in relationship to trust. So I looked at cases of what I call epistemic trust injustice. And what I meant by that is there are some kinds of knowledge, and scientific knowledge will be a good example of that, where the only way I can know it is by trusting someone. With the scientific experts or those who are reporting on the scientific expertise, that's the only way I can know it. I can't know it on my own. And so that makes me vulnerable in such a way. But we know that it's not just trust we want. What we want is trust to be balanced with the trustworthiness. Obviously, I could be too gullible, and that would not serve my epistemic interests well. To be a good knower, I don't want to be too gullible, and I don't want to be too skeptical. So what I need is to have a trustworthy source. And that means that to responsibly place my trust in someone, I need to have some reason. I mean, I never have enough, because otherwise it's not trust if I had all the reasons in the world. But I need some sort of a sense that you're a trustworthy source. Now, let's come back to science and oppression. That if I am aware that my group has not been served well by science, my group's been exploited, perhaps in the past, or we've been actively harmed or anything like that, those are all reasons to wonder if this is a trustworthy source or not. If that is a systemic case where those reasons are not available, even if empirically they actually are creating good knowledge, and it would be nice if I could believe them, but if I have a lot of evidence not to believe them, then I'm calling that an epistemic trust injustice, because I'm not in a position, sure, I could trust, but I'd be gullible to be trusting if I had a whole bunch of reasons not to. And sometimes we do actually do that. But my point is that's an important way of recognizing how someone could be disadvantaged by a history of science interacting with oppression in such a way that there's actually reasons to be a little bit suspicious. But yet the only way I could know is if I sort of invested in that trust with what might be a trustworthy source.
That seems to put
Does that help?
Oh yeah, that was wonderful. And it seems to put a lot of the onus on scientific institutions to be trustworthy and demonstrate their credibility and trustworthiness to the public, not just to put the demand on the public to figure it out. Is that a
That's
fair
true.
characterization?
Yeah, that's true. And again, I think ultimately it's going to have to be, if we're trying to, if what we need are robust trust relations, there will be some role to play on both. But it is exactly that point that if there is no, why should there be an expectation that you're going to be trusted, particularly when you're coming out of a history like that, right? If we want people to be able to responsibly place their trust. Yeah, so that's where the historical legacy is a tough one to get over in some cases, because it's hard to rebuild relations of trust if there have been betrayals.
Can I bring in questions from the audience now? There's some good ones. I'm looking at the Q&A. This one, I'm not doing it in order. This one seems pertinent to what you just said. I'll read it. How can we think or deal with the fact that science is practiced within institutions, especially universities, that are opaque to most people? People aren't in a position to know about the scientists' trust securing practices. And also these institutions are known to be complicit in oppression. So what obligations do even non-scientific academics have to address these kinds of problems, these sort of distancing between the people and these knowledge producing institutions?
Yeah, well, I think outreach, of course, is a big piece of that, and a recognition that as those in academic institutions, there is a responsibility to connect with those in our society who are outside of that, and actually give reasons for why why what we're presenting might be useful or whatever. I do think in the case of, yes, institutions have been complicit in much of this. I do think there's also been, we are seeing more changes. There are more, certainly within, like if you look at the National Science Foundation, there's certainly interest in requirements for grants and funding, that there be some attention to outreach, to connection, to communication, but not just do your research and then sort of give some kind of presentation, but actually be more involved with communities, especially if you're researching about those communities, but not just that. They recognize that that's an important piece of making it fulfilling. If you want that authority, then you have to earn it. And that's unfortunately more than just the scientific work. It's also very difficult, since scientists have a lot to do, but there's more to it here. It's also not all up to the scientists, in that we know that there are also problems with how nobody gets their information from the scientists themselves, right? They usually get them from media and other or government policy papers, things, other sources, which also there are issues of trust in those communicators, right? So we get sort of these concentric circles going round and round, and we need to build sort of a structure of more trustworthy relations.
It's an observation and then a question. An observation was made by one of the attendees that science tends to be most closely scrutinized when it starts affecting dominant groups in society. For example, when eugenics affected white people, but it's often overlooked when it affects marginalized or minority groups. The question was, do you agree with this observation? But I already knew you were going to say yes. I think the great question is, if so, what do you think drives this behavior? And given this sort of characterization that you're providing of the importance of trusting relationships, what do we do about that uneven critical scrutiny that's given with marginalized versus dominant groups?
Right. Well, I mean, one piece of that is, I mean, why does that happen? Because some groups have the power. Right. So that's then, but I mean, it's also, that's not very helpful to give that answer. And I think it again, having a more diverse representation within some of those positions will lead to more attention of where there's when certain things are affecting certain groups. And but I also want to say that I do think it's important from a societal point of view. Ultimately, we will need to be interested in the interests of others besides our own group, right? And that's whatever position you're in. That's how we're going to manage to have a society through which everyone can flourish and not expect all of us to have the same needs. So we do need to always be looking outside of ourselves in that. But that's, again, that is in no way meant to undermine the concern of the fact that lots of times the attention is only given when it starts to upset those who actually have the dominant group who has a fair amount of power.
Here's a question having to do with Indigenous knowledge claims. I'll read the question. How do we approach knowledge claims from Indigenous communities whose knowledge is rendered uninterpretable and unintelligible within the present day scientifically oriented context?
Right. So this is another big issue in terms of how do we think about science and whether or not it is always the right kind of knowledge that we need for a particular situation. I do think that there's a lot of work that has been done to insist that, and when I'm saying science now, I'm just going to be narrowing it to our institutionalized science that we're thinking of, because certainly there are ways of understanding what there are ways of understanding some Indigenous knowledges as being scientific. Lots of it is empirical. It's based on observation and sometimes oral history. But I do think there have been some improvements in terms of trying to work with and use different local knowledges or traditional knowledges to try to inform where there are holes in. But this issue of it being uninterpretable, this is a challenge, because I do think at the end of the day, it is difficult. In some cases, it won't be. In some cases, it will be obvious how you can bring the two forms of knowledge together and what might give some sustenance to say a scientific project. That in other cases, I think the fact that there are times when it's uninterpretable, they don't basically. I wouldn't have put it uninterpretable. My worry would be, how do you integrate them? How do you integrate them into one project if the starting points are very different and the understandings of what it takes for a sound research project are so different? So that integration is an issue. But then it also becomes, I also think it's important to always be thinking about, we're trying to gain knowledge. Why do we think we need it? What are our goals? And there are many times when I don't need to go to science to understand what I need to do to just get around in my backyard in my little garden or whatever. I mean, there's lots I could do, but if my goals are only to, let's put it this way, I might have to be a master gardener to be able to have this beautiful garden or whatever. But if I just want to like get my oregano going and that's all my goal is, I don't need to go to do that. That has to do with the amount of knowledge, but you can think of that in terms of frameworks of knowing and practices of knowing too. I don't think we always need science, and science sometimes can make things worse. There are lots of cases also when science can be done very well in the lab, but it might be misleading in that it might not be paying attention to what the problems are on the ground in a particular context. Nancy McHugh has an article in her book, The Limits of Science, on toxicology work on Agent Orange, and the fact that it was coming up. It's as the science that was done was not paying attention to the Vietnamese who, after the Vietnam War, were living very close to Agent Orange dumps, and they kept being told that it wouldn't be a problem for them, but they live in their houses, it's dirt floors, so they're actually in contact with the earth all the time, and they're eating fish and that, and so the science wasn't capturing the health issues that they were having with Agent Orange. That's because it was done in the lab and wasn't taking seriously the actual context, the living context.
But there's going to be someone that hears your answer and says, well, that just means the science wasn't done well. It just missed a few features. Do you think it's more to it than that? If they'd only
Um,
known people were in more contact with the dirt, then the science would have been stellar.
Perhaps, but why didn't they know that, right?
Okay.
Or
Mhm.
why were they working with the assumption that a framework within their laboratory would give them the toxicology information that that they could draw their conclusions from? So yeah, that's part of it. And of course, the more you extend it out and say, well, why didn't they know it? And if they were in conversation, if they were really looking at it in this broader sense. The other thing, of course, is that as you get more, why does science get done in the lab? Much science gets done in the lab, because that's where you can control the variables, right? And that's where you can get into exactly what's causing by isolating. You can't do that in the real interactive on the ground world, which means it's complicated and also it might be messy in that way. And then you've got to ask yourself, well, what do I need to know in order to solve this problem, right?
Correct. Very good answer. You're getting into that problem of generalizability, which is so vexing. Okay, here's a different question for you about creating more diversity in science. An audience member asked, why can't alternative structures that would support a more diverse science be constructed outside of the existing scientific research framework, as opposed to your solutions had much to do with fixing within science? What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I mean, I don't know, why couldn't we have both? Like, I also think that if we're talking about outside the institution of science, then I want to know, how are we defining the institutions, the sciences that we have? Because there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of variety in methods. There's also a lot of variety in institutions. And of course, we've kind of been talking about it. And my example of Arizona State, and also examples of, my example of National Science Foundation. I mean, those are also academic institutions, government sponsored. We also know there's a whole other issue of science that's done through private enterprise, where there are fewer controls in terms of, say, there's no obligation if one's within private enterprise for thinking about everybody's interests, right? But in cases of academic institutions and in cases of federal funds or whatever, there is definitely some kind of social contract that there should be some connection here. So I don't think that has to be an either or, but I do think it's an interesting question of thinking about it from the outside, but also transforming. And at some point, the inside outside, I'm not sure how much it's going to matter, except if we're thinking of, are we worried that the authorities coming with the legitimacy of being in a particular institution, right? And so that's certainly worth thinking some more about.
Thank you. Here's a totally different direction in questions. It's around animal experimentation. Would you call experimentation on animals part of the oppressive systems of science?
Yeah, I certainly see that as a case where we have changed our standards, and they're still changing in terms of what we feel we are ethically bound to not do, or how we will or will not perform. I mean, we have human subjects research committees that have to check everything. We've got animal research committees that have to check everything for non-human animals, and their different standards, right? There's certainly lots of philosophical work that does draw the comparison and talk about the way that we interact with animals and the way that we treat animals as being oppressive. I don't work in that area specifically, but I certainly think those are questions that we have to ask ourselves as a society, and come to understand what our relationships are with animals, and what that means for what we're willing and not willing to do. And of course, we know that there's an awful lot of our human medicine that has been highly dependent on experimentation on animals, non-human animals, that we would not have done on ourselves, right? At that point, at least, right? And Maya, you know more about that than I do in terms of the research process in medical research.
Yeah, just to comment on that, there is it's certainly the case. This seems relevant to also add that there are increasingly we're getting alternatives to using animals or methods that allow us to use less animals for, let's say, for safety studies. And there is often resistance to using it just because animal models is what we do, or animal experimentation is what we do, and that might warrant some of the thinking about how we think about animals and how we use them, and that fits into oppression too. Here's a question. I know we're almost out of time, so this might be the last question. A question about how the scale of public trust in science. How necessary is it? There's this observation made here that most sciences don't need much more than societal permission for it to function. Let's say physics. I think the suggestion here is something that's a little bit more removed from public interest, while perhaps others need more. Can you say something about the types and maybe degrees of public trust that's needed in science in order for it to function well?
Yeah, that's actually a really nice question. But I also want to say that I think sometimes we can think that we don't need the public trust in physics as much, although, there's been a lot of human interests that have gone into the particular directions that physics research has gone. Lots of military funding and lots of driving in that direction. So I think it's definitely not as it's not as big of a continuum as you might think. But I think that also connects with where I started earlier when I was speaking about if there are things where I'm not really making myself vulnerable, then is it really a trust that we need or not, in terms of how we think about the results of what's going on with physics? But certainly in cases of where we're putting our research attention and where we're putting our funding in that is I think a bigger issue for us to think about. Are we happy with how we're using our resources, or where we're putting those resources? Yeah, so and I also do think there's always going to be a place, we definitely should still have a place for basic science where we don't know where it's going. That's really important because we don't know where it's going. And lots of times it's both fascinating, and that is exciting as human beings to be resolving some of those puzzles, but also you never know where the next big thing's going to come out, what next big thing is going to come out of there that will then help us solve one of our major problems that we have on this planet.